Researchers determined in 1972 that society was on pace to collapse by 2030. According to a follow-up analysis completed by KPMG experts, we are ahead of schedule. For at least 10,000 years, advanced human civilizations have existed. Many vast empires rose from nothing to nothing during that period, leaving behind only relics and crumbling buildings. While historians cannot tell for certain what caused each of these specific collapses, the deciding variables seem to fall into four major groups. Political concerns, social and cultural issues, environmental issues, and of course, economic issues are all of particular importance to us. Any civilization that has been reduced to little more than a footnote in a textbook has succumbed to some combination of these four reasons. Some were nearly quick, such as the magnificent city of Pompeii falling to Mount Vesuvius explosion. Others took a few weeks, such as the Aztec Empire collapsing after 93 days of fight against the Spanish, while yet others took centuries. 300 years separate the Roman Empire's peak and its final demise. Our modern civilization is the greatest ever known, hundreds of thousands of times wealthier and more advanced than even history's most massive empires could have imagined. If you are watching this film, you have internet access. If you have internet connection, you have access to a source of information that academics and rulers could not have imagined a century ago. The same may be said for numerous modern conveniences that we take for granted. Climate control, global travel, inexpensive and effective clothes, medication, quick communication, ample and safe food, running water, and even little indulgences like being able to listen to your favorite music anytime you want. Who is the wealthiest individual in history? I am frequently asked. The answer is Jeff Bezos. He was valued more than $121.8 billion. Depending on when you see this video, that figure may have changed. But what about Rockefeller, the Rothschilds, the Romanovs, or this Mansa Musa guy that everyone keeps bringing up? How about they? They were wealthy for their period, yet it was a time of nearly widespread poverty. Despite their relative riches, they couldn't imagine having all of the luxuries that you take for granted. Let me tell you, if I had to choose between my modern two-bedroom rented apartment and a sprawling 15th century French palace with no air conditioning, no plumbing, and no food that wouldn't give me cholera, I'd take the apartment 10 times out of 10, and you'd be a fool if you didn't. The best thing is that I have yet to mention war. Despite what most people believe based on their consumption of cable news and the main page of Reddit, we are living in one of the most tranquil times in human history. This has mostly been due to a convergence of technology, education, and global collaboration. Even nations with bitter hostility simmering under the surface are more reliant on one another now than even the closest of allies were during Napoleon's reign. Why become hostile when you may get wealthy? It may sound insignificant, but it is a good thing, albeit a fickle one. Comparing our current global economy to even the most powerful civilizations in history is like comparing a jet engine to a donkey. That is not exaggeration. That is how far ahead we are now. But this is the real issue. A jet engine is more powerful and quicker than a donkey, but it is less robust. A single error in its extraordinarily intricate network of interconnected components might render the entire system worthless. Worse, it moves so quickly and so high that even the tiniest blip becomes disastrous. Most of us living today, particularly those of us sitting at home watching online movies on our iPhones, would not be able to survive for long if food was not readily available, sometimes physically brought to our door. But I'm getting ahead of myself and sounding like some kind of lunatic doomsday survivalist shouting the end is near. So let's break down just how this research projected civilization will collapse. What measurable indicators were researchers looking at to evaluate whether the world was heading in the right or wrong direction? What did these indicators tell us about the alleged breakdown of our society? Finally, is the fact that this report is ahead of schedule cause for concern, or is it simply a matter of giving too much weight to the statistical correlations? Okay, so the researchers' study, entitled The Limits to Growth, sought to determine if our present use of the world's resources was sustainable. Unfortunately, it wasn't. The study was one of the first to employ computers with dynamic, systematic models in economic research. I'm not a computer scientist, so there are lots of experts who can describe system dynamics far better than me, but in a nutshell, it's a piece of software that seeks to reproduce the workings of complicated real-life systems and software. It seems very similar to us today, but keep in mind that this was happening in the 1960s and 1970s, when computers looked like this and had about as much computing capacity as your kettle. Despite these constraints, they finally developed World 3, a computer model of the world economy. This software modeled everything from fluctuating population growth to industrial capacity, as well as how everything would interact with one another. A huge population, for example, will naturally require more resources, more food, more water, more dwellings, more of everything. But a greater population will also necessitate more creativity. With a population of 8 billion, we have a lot higher chance of discovering a Tesla, Da Vinci, Haber, Bosch, or Whittle than with a population of 2 billion, which is where the globe was just a century ago. It's a running joke among macroeconomists that any change to the economy affects at least 3 other things. In our models, we may obfuscate this issue by assuming ceteris paribus, or that all other things are equal. This economic assumption is useful for examining cause and effect in isolation. For example, a soda tax raises the price of and hence lowers demand for sugary beverages, all else being equal. But this is the real world, and nothing ever stays the same simply because it's simpler to simulate. Predicting the future is difficult at best, and nearly impossible if practically every circumstance is not taken into account. That is exactly what World 3 sought to achieve. The World 3 program included systems for simulating anything from birth rates to agricultural technologies. The concept was that all of these factors were critical to maintaining our contemporary lifestyle. But since they interacted with one another, they were vulnerable to feedback loops. The concept of a feedback loop originated in musical performances. If you've ever held a microphone up to a loudspeaker, you'll be familiar with the awful high-pitched sound that comes out of it. That's because the microphone detects a strong noise and instructs the speaker to amplify and play it much louder, only for the loud noise to be picked up by the microphone again. The same thing may happen with economies. For example, decreased birth rates can result in an aging population, which puts additional financial strain on younger employees to care for the old, either directly by caring for them at home or indirectly through taxes to pay pension systems and aged care. Because of this financial pressure, younger employees will have less time and fewer favorable conditions to start their own families, resulting in even lower birth rates. This is a really important case in terms of the research. While the study's computer-generated model of the global economy accounted for hundreds of factors, it was only interested in tracking 5 of them. Population, industrial output, food production, available resources, and pollution were among them. It's worth noting that this study was released in 1972, long before climate change was more than a blip on the scientific community's radar, and certainly not the widely acknowledged concern it is today. If the study was repeated today, it would very certainly contain average worldwide temperatures, but it wasn't. Therefore, it didn't. Despite this, you should be able to see that all of these individual elements are quite significant to how we live and work today all over the world. But maybe what is more important is how they end up interacting with one another. Let us return to the economist's safe area for a moment and pretend that everything else is equal save food and population. These variables are plainly interdependent. If one moves, the other will follow suit, everything else being equal. But what appears to be a more worrying sequence of events? A decrease in population that causes a decrease in food production, or a decrease in food production that causes a decrease in population. Yes, those are obviously 2 very distinct cases. So, now that we know how to analyze the data provided by this report, what exactly did it say? The researchers, like any good economist, hedged their bets. Predicting the future precisely is a fool's errand. They might have published their study one day before a design for a commercially feasible fusion reactor emerged, and the researchers knew this, so they modified the beginning parameters and ran the simulation repeatedly. In certain scenarios, they would assume that innovation continues at its present rate and worker productivity continues to rise at its current rate. In other scenarios, they would suppose that technological advancement would continue to compound itself, making things like collecting resources from space or growing food in laboratories a possibility. In subsequent simulations, they would anticipate that technological advancement would gradually plateau. A brief aside, a technological plateau may not seem particularly plausible to us now, but that's only because most of us have grown up in an era of continual invention. Moore's Law is an excellent illustration of this. Over the past 5 decades, computer power has about quadrupled every 2 years. But we are approaching the physical limitations of how many transistors can be packed onto a microchip. Promising technologies such as quantum computing may overcome this problem and allow us to access even more processing power. But it may not, and this is only one example. A lot of technology innovation these days is basically huge corporations coming up with new and clever methods for you to spend time while consuming advertising material. In any case, technical innovation was only one of the variables that the researchers of this paper adjusted. They also ran models with other assumptions, such as lower birth rates, higher recycling rates, more resource finds, higher levels of global commerce, and lower levels of global trade. In this economic model, they basically tried to account for every possible outcome with a realistic combination of factors. They then summed the paths of 5 critical variables to predict where mankind will end up. As you might expect from a variety of models with variables that varied every time, they received a variety of different findings, but they all had one thing in common. They all exhibited a large decrease around 2030. Of course, it's difficult to address all of the hundreds of potential outcomes that were modeled, so the researchers concentrated on a handful that were well inside the standard deviation of these potential outcomes. The first, and potentially most optimistic, outcome was known as the comprehensive technology scenario. This was a model in which we continued to live as we do now, but technology advanced quickly enough to ensure our productive capacity could keep up with all of the new people who needed to be fed, housed, and clothed. The model still anticipates a major reduction in food production, mostly owing to river pollution and the mismanagement of arable land. But this is addressed by technological innovation. The population does begin to level out around 2030, but this is due to the natural propensity of wealthier, more urban societies to have fewer children, rather than people starving to death due to a shortage of food. In this scenario, industrial output peaks and declines, which would ordinarily imply decreased living standards. But this is nearly totally offset by more effective use of the things we do have. If technology advanced to the point where we had self-driving cars tomorrow, the need for individual car ownership would be greatly reduced. This would likely lead to a decrease in industrial output. But it is not that we would be poorer as a result. It is simply that a car that previously served only one household can now be efficiently shared amongst dozens. This is exactly what the World Economic Forum meant when they famously stated, "You will own nothing and be happy about it," indicating that they either don't understand how to communicate with the general public or secretly enjoy making people angry. More effective resource utilization would help minimize pollution and ensure that raw materials are never depleted. This would not be a completely disastrous consequence, and although we would not continue to witness the exponential development in living standards that we have seen over the last century or two, it would also not constitute a social collapse. If you don't trust a fresh wave of technological progress to save mankind, the academics who produced this paper suggest an option. The so-called stable world scenario describes what would happen if the world just maintained its present rate of innovation, while also massively investing in areas like renewable energy sources and material recycling systems. Again, this model was created before climate change was considered a concern. So, when we discuss recycling and renewables, we are looking at it solely through the lens of resource depletion and local pollution, completely ignoring other externalities such as carbon emissions. In many ways, this stabilized global scenario resembles the complete technology result that we discussed previously. The significant difference is an almost voluntary decline in industrial output before it causes difficulties such as food shortages and excessive pollution. The researchers picked this model as the most optimistic of all the models based on all of the potential combinations of factors. Again, most hopeful, barring some bizarre and unexpected technical advance that fundamentally changes how we manage our economy. This may happen, and hopefully will, but it's difficult to make specific arrangements for technology that we can't even imagine, with the exception of perhaps a spiritual sacrifice to Jeff Bezos. Anyway, while the original 1972 research felt this may be something we could realistically aim towards, the timing of all of the collected elements in this result has the least close fit to our present reality. as studied by the 2021 follow-up study. Gaia Harrington's research, on the other hand, reveals that the path we're on best reflects what the 1972 researchers named the business as usual 2 scenario, and that's not good. This is a model that clearly shows a collapse. Pollution continues to rise rapidly, while common material recycling has never proven economically viable or extensively funded. The amount of industrial output is larger than in all other scenarios, but that is where the good news ends. Food production declines precipitate significantly dropping birth rates in affluent countries and famines in poor countries. The shortage of youthful labor limits industrial production, thus impeding economic growth. Easily available resources are also depleting, further reducing industrial productivity and economic prosperity. According to all reports, this is a complete breakdown of civilization. I stated at the start of this video that I would rather be a middle-class worker in today's environment than a monarch from more than 150 years ago. If business as usual continues, I would prefer be a middle-class worker now than a monarch just 20 years from now, which is a very terrifying concept. So, if you're feeling nervous as I did when reading this study, it's crucial to address the model's flaws. Research that basically amounts to someone yelling that the world is about to end is certain to be treated with skepticism, and the Limits to Growth report was no exception. It's worth noting that many of these concerns have been proven false simply by the data following the forecasts in the business-as-usual model with scary precision. Other critics point out that this study models human invention in a very gloomy manner. These opponents admitted that, while our current rate of innovation may not be adequate to avert this type of collapse, need is the mother of invention. When humanity's back is against the proverbial wall, much greater emphasis will be placed on studying and investing in technologies that can move us away from the apocalyptic scenario of the business-as-usual paradigm and toward the more acceptable comprehensive technology scenario. We can already see this happening, with a significant increase in the availability of renewable technology in the general market. There are still certain areas where we fall short, waste management being a major one, but we are well ahead of where we were even a decade ago. If you want me to tell you what I believe will happen, I'm sorry, but I'd rather you read the 2 papers for yourself. I want to be positive about the future in general, but I also recognize that my view does not carry nearly the same weight as research released by a group of 17 of the world's finest economists and scientists. Research that has been validated by another extremely bright people. Best case scenario, this was all hugely exaggerated, and we could use it to learn about the limitations of constructing systematic models to forecast the future. Worst case scenario, well, I suppose it's time to start learning how to search for food in the woods, which you can start right now. That's all for now, folks. If you learned something, please make sure that you click the like button in order to make YouTube happy and for more insightful business and political case studies. Please subscribe to our channel. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.